17104.com. This is Zanetta Wingfield, and you're listening to The Voice 17104.com. The Voice 17104.com. Welcome to Did You Know? Podcast, your host, Richard Utley, dedicated to the African American viewers. The program is aimed to celebrate African American culture and deal with the real and relevant topics that impact the everyday lives of the African American community through frank and insightful dialogue with local and national influencers. Every day, there's another horrible, discouraging news story, directly or indirectly, impacting African Americans. But we need to look at the shining stars in the galaxy of Black America. It is time to tell our story. Good evening, and welcome to another Did You Know? Well, I'm going to start out with, it's very important because today is election day. And for some of you who forgot about it, you still got time to get out to vote. And some of you that's still hemming and hawing, it's very important that we exercise our vote. A lot of people lost their lives so that we could vote. So you got an hour and a half to get out there and do what you need to do and support those people who you feel that can do the job for you. And I've said this before, we have to start rewarding those people who support the things that we believe in and punishing those that do not. And I think that one of the things I'm going to be doing for the next year and a half, because I think it's very important, we're going to talk about elections and the accountability of it and the importance of it. I don't know how many of you know this, but right now we have 23 Black mayors in Pennsylvania. 23. And there's a primary today in Philadelphia, Washington, PA, and McKeesport. So that shows you that we're making progress and we should continue to make progress. But we also have to keep our eye on the needle. And why do I say that? Well, you look all over and see what's going on in other places, but a lot of things are going on in a lot of places that eventually could happen where you live at, and it'll be too late. Let's talk about some of the pushes in other states. Let's talk about the Republicans in Texas. They're trying to create avenues so that we cannot vote. So I hope you do some research on it. They're passing all kinds of bills, or they're attempting to pass all kinds of bills. They're trying to limit voting places in certain areas of Texas, like, for example, in Harris County, this in Houston, which is one of the largest. So they're targeting areas where there's Black and brown people. And we need to be aware of that, and we need to hold them accountable for that. They're even talking about craziness about no mail-in ballots for people over 65. They're talking about maybe their conversations not having college students vote. All of these is to keep you from voting. Even though a lot of our forefathers went through a lot to vote. Some of them lost their lives. You remember, I'm sure a lot of you have heard stories about poll tax. I'm sure you have told all kinds of stories. So you don't really need to not think how concerned this is. Every now and then I run into people say, I'm not voting, it don't count. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it does count. Especially local, to control your school board. I've also talked to you how important it is that you make sure that you get involved. Whether it's city council, whether it's school board, whether it's magistrates or judges, it all controls your life. So don't get confused and say, well, I really don't care because I don't care. The president of the United States is going to do whatever the president of the United States is going to do. All politics is local. And all of you better keep your eyes up, because I don't know if you're aware of it or not. Pennsylvania has some issues as well. The whole idea of mail-in voting has not gone away. Matter of fact, there's a couple candidates on the GOP side right now that's talking about getting rid of mail-in voting. So what does that tell you? Yeah, there's two right now running on the Supreme Court on the GOP side. They're talking about mail-in voting. Now, why is that important? If all of you are not aware, finally in the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania, they're the ones that gave the nod to mail-in voting because it was challenged. And if you understand politics at this point, per se, even though judicial should be blind and shouldn't be Democrat or Republican, it should be about good judicial leadership and temperament, it is not that way. And right now, people believe that the Democrats control the Supreme Court. I guess we could look at that in terms of, in Washington, in terms of the conservatives are controlling the Supreme Court of the United States and some of their rulings. So I would hope that we better keep our eyes on that. Because if we don't, we're going to be in trouble. Because all of you know, they've been talking about fraud and mail-in voting, and you can't count on it. 2021, 2022, and it hasn't gone away. And where are the places that they're talking about fraud? I just want you to think about that. I mean, where is it at? I'm just asking all of you that. Where is that at? Where are they looking at fraud? In areas that are black and brown or poor, or people that they think don't have a real say. They think people that won't come out to vote. And that's why it's going to be very important that we do get out to vote. And we can't, like I said, we got to keep our eye on the needle. I don't know if all of you are looking at it, but the United States Supreme Court has agreed on Monday to hear a case examining whether South Carolina congressional map was drawn against the black voters of the certain district. Alexander versus South Carolina State Conference of NAACP. The NAACP decided to take them to court, and the lower court ruled that yes, those lines were drawn on racial gerrymandering. And so naturally, South Carolina felt the need to take it to the Supreme Court. And it's at the Supreme Court, so we'll see how the ruling will be. That's how important who we elect, because it will affect us. So if you understand it, I'll put it in perspective for you. What is being said is the United States Supreme Court is looking at a case now where there was a district in South Carolina that the House and the Senate in their government drew the lines. And they said, well, we think it's not fair. We think it's a disadvantage to the minority community. And now the U.S. Supreme Court's going to take a look at it. They could have kicked it back to the lower courts, or they could have did many things. But they're going to take a look at it. And right now, you know the kind of rulings that's been ruled in the U.S. Supreme Court. So we better keep our fingers crossed. Before I get to my guests, I've said to you that history is very important, and we need to know our history, because obviously it's become a big controversial about our history, or should history be shared or told. I believe that we have an obligation to teach our own history. I think we have an obligation to do our job. Stop waiting on somebody else doing your job. So I've made a decision starting tonight. Every program I'm having, I'm going to give you 3 words. And I want you to look those words up. And I want you to find out what they mean, because it does have an effect on you. The first one is going to be the middle passage. That's number 1. Number 2, Dred Scott decision. 2. And number 3, I thought would be very interesting, so I threw it in. The Missouri Compromise. Because I thought I'd throw that in because that'll make you do a little bit more research and understand certain things about how the United States and how the states were developed. So you got them? The Middle Passage, Dred Scott decision, and the Missouri Compromise. And every time I have a program, I'm going to give you 3 subjects to look up. I'm not going to tell you what they are. I'm not going to sit here and tell you what the Middle Passage is. I'm not going to tell you what the Dred Scott decision or the Missouri Compromise, but I will tell you this. They all had an effect on you. I can show you that. Well, this evening, I have the great opportunity to bring a good friend and a good person on. And I think today, since we're getting ready to go into Memorial Day, I think it's just great to have Barbara Barksdale on the program. I had Barbara on my program some time ago, and I had her on because she is the person that I call her the Dr. Gates of Central Pennsylvania. She helps you find your roots. And I can say she helped me find my roots. Some of it was good, some of it was bad, but she helped me find my roots. But first, we're going to talk about something that I'm just so proud of her about, is that many of you, there was a cemetery called Midland Cemetery in Solterra Township. And this woman, for 32 years, had a vision, had a dream, and she stayed to it. She didn't let the naysayers, because I know she had some, she didn't let anybody stop her plight of Midland Cemetery. And what's so great about it, this historical Black cemetery has been added to the National Register. And so I wanted her to come on here in my program, and I wanted her to talk about it, because sometimes we don't realize the significance and the importance of what's around us. So Barb, would you please tell these wonderful people who you are, who may not know who you are, please.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to be on your show again. I truly enjoy talking to you and also making sure that the public learns a little bit more. You know, I love the fact that you're giving them 3 things to look at: the Middle Passage, Dred Scott, and the Missouri, because it all pertains to certain people that's at the Midland Cemetery, you know, because they had to live through a lot of that, you know. So with that being said, I am known as the Cemetery Lady. I'm usually introduced as the Cemetery Lady, and that's because I love my little cemetery called Midland Cemetery. But I also am the chairperson for the Pennsylvania Hallowed Grounds, which we have well over 100 cemeteries throughout the state of Pennsylvania that we're trying to take care of, or let's say support the stewards that are taking care of those cemeteries, like Midland Cemetery, you know, to restore, preserve it, and also definitely use it for educational purposes. So let's talk.
Okay, let's talk. What is it? What is this? It's a cemetery. I mean, I hear the word cemetery. There's a lot of cemeteries, but could you explain where it is and what the significance of Midland Cemetery?
Well, Midland Cemetery is located, just to give you a huge landmark, which be the borough of Stilton. It's outside of the borough of Stilton. It is located within the boundaries of Sweater Township. And I have to put it like that because of the fact that the township was mostly farmland, which is still pretty good farmland there in Sweater Township. But the borough of Stilton had a lot of the communities of various people, including obviously African American or African people. A lot of them that came in through either being enslaved to begin with, those who were the freedom seekers, as well as those who were with the migrations coming from the southern states up to the north. As time progressed and the steel mills were flourishing and they needed more help, and people were looking for jobs, especially after slavery, and for education. And then, the spinoff of starting one piece of land and one piece of industry caused a community to grow. Within that community, you end up having not only the industry, but you also have the churches, you have the schools, you have that community togetherness, you have the neighborhoods. And that's what the borough of Stilton is comprised of, the neighborhoods. Our neighborhood basically was on, here in Stilton early on, like on Adams Street. And then there's other little sprinklings of Blacks, African Americans all throughout the borough, and also Harrisburg, and also in Sweater Township. And those are the people who are laid to rest at Midland Cemetery. Now, I'm going to try to share a screen here for a second. I hope that you will bear with me. Let me see if I can do this. I'm not the best at it, so you might have to, I don't know if you can talk me back into this, but see, share. Okay. All right. Can you see the screen at all?
Yes.
Okay. And that has the word "the beginning." Okay. That was Midland Cemetery when I first started, like 32 years ago. All right. You can't see any headstones. All you see is trees. Hopefully you can see it pretty good there. It's trees, weeds, and just a little bit of everything else, There's a lot of debris in there. There was a lot of people that was using it for witchcraft. There was people that was using it for everything else as a dump. It was used for everything other than a place to place our relatives and to keep them honored and respected. So that was the beginning. That's what I started with. So I just wanted to share that with you. And I'm going to share one more screen with you. And this is, again, that same picture in the left-hand corner. And you'll see in the bottom picture, there's some people within that picture that started to help me cut down those trees. And if you take a really good look in the background, you'll see a house really deep down into the back of that. Unfortunately, it's hard for me to show everything, and then we start finding headstones. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing at this point. I just want to give you an idea of what we were dealing with way back. Okay.
Yeah, and I think that's important. And I think one of the things I like for you to share, the significance in terms of having enslaved people that were put in the woods, and now we're trying to identify their history and their ancestry, because unfortunately, a lot of us have no way to connect to who we really are.
Mhm.
I remember when you did my research, when, yes, there were certain things that I did know, or
Mhm.
certain things that I assumed. I mean, did I know that I came from an enslaved people's group? Yes, I did. But as you continue to do the research, I realized the importance of how you want to pay honor to your ancestors, because even for me, seeing that document that said that some of my relatives were enslaved people, and seeing it in writing, had a
Mhm.
very tearful moment for me. It was a reality check. And so seeing that you realize that this cemetery was there and had all these people that were thrown there, no finalization, that's very important. So what made you decide that you wanted to go on that journey?
Well, I don't think it was me that was deciding to go on that journey. It was God who said, "I'm going to sneak this in on this girl and have her do it for me." The actual start off was because of my grandfather, who is buried there at Midland Cemetery, and he was dead many, many years before I was born. Okay, my mom and dad would go into the woods. I mean, literally into the woods, and put down flowers every memorial, weekend, year after year. I would be left in the car as they would disappear up the little hill and into the woods. And then they come out without any flowers. And I was given the story of her father being buried there. So I was, it was just one of those moments where it was January, it was winter, it was snow and ice on the roads. And because of that, Stilton, and we're in Pennsylvania, we live within a mountain. People don't realize we are living in a mountain, and so people were sliding down the hill and banging into cars, and the police stopped us and made me and other people turn around. And because of that being diverted, you know how they say in the Bible that God has your footsteps? He had my footsteps. He had my car wheels because it had me going past the Midland Cemetery. And I was telling my son, who was approximately 10 or 11 at the time, that that's where his great grandfather was buried. All right. And it dawned on me by the time I got home safely, thank God, that maybe I can get this, his grave cleaned up before spring came, and I would be able to make sure that I honored what my mother would always like to do. Well, spring came and gone, and I was still trying to figure out who owned the property, what can I do to get the property taken care of. And I was reaching out to all kinds of folks, and I talked to the people at Sweater Township, and I talked to a few others that was in association with it. And they told me that if I go on that property, they were going to put me in jail. So I decided that I'll go public. I'll let them know what they want to do with me. And that's how it all got started. And from that point forward, when I had, and like you say, when people want to talk against you and put you down, there was one person, and I won't ever say her name, but she said, "Oh, so you're going to clean up your grandfather and nobody else?" And I don't know about you, but I'm the kind of person that's like, if you dare me, I'm going to do it, So that's what I did. I decided, okay, well, you know what? I'm not going to clean up my grandfather until it's near the end or to the end. And I'll clean up everybody else's, not knowing that it was going to be a long journey. And believe me, it's been a long journey.
I think some of the audience would be aware, probably people my age, but maybe people a little younger.
Mhm.
A lot of them don't understand that early on, the cemeteries were segregated.
Mhm.
And people may not understand two things. Cemeteries were segregated, and some of the ways the cemeteries, or whatever you want to call them, wherever they put the enslaved person's remains, was not always treated with the dignity that it should have been. And so would you comment on that, please?
Well, we have an area at Midland Cemetery that we call Ancestors Grove. All right. And that's at the bottom of the hill, under the street and across the street. That is next to the property of the Stilton High Spar School District. And it's right up against it, tree to tree, cell to cell. It's right up against it. And I had found in doing my research that there was quite a few slaves that were here in Sweater Township. Keep in mind, when slavery was happening, the borough of Stilton nor Baldwin or Ewington, none of that had even been in foresight to know that it was going to ever be here. So we're talking about going into the 1700s, early 1800s. And so I found a listing of some of the slaves that were here. And of course, at the time, if you're going to be enslaved, you're not going to be in any of the people's white cemeteries. The white cemetery is approximately a quarter of a mile away. If you know where the William Howard Day Cemetery is located, right across the street as you go up through the middle of the William Howard Day Cemetery, which is the cemetery, or was the cemetery for the people of African Americans, which started in 1942. The cemetery right beside it, called the Baldwin Cemetery, was the white cemetery. So you had the black cemetery down the road, a quarter of a mile. You had the Ancestors Grove, which a lot of people of the modern world did not even know existed. They did not know that they were driving over every time they drive down Calker Street in Stilton, Sweater Township, that was part of the cemetery and still is part of the cemetery property. And they had no clue that this cemetery over there was for the blacks. So you had the Baldwin whites, you had the Midland Cemetery for the Blacks. And so it's always been segregated. There's a law on the books in Pennsylvania that actually says that if any of the people owned slaves and they needed to bury them, they had the choice if they wanted to bury them on their property. They also had the choice to bury them outside of their property or at the edge of their property. And so I surmise from taking a look at old maps and looking at deeds and everything like that, with the help of some of the people that has helped me over the years with at mapping, because I wasn't the best. I'm still not the best at mapping, but a woman by the name of Jeannie has helped me tremendously with doing a lot of mapping to see where the people's property lines line up. And we had to do a lot of that just for my sake, to make sure we knew where our boundaries were, but also it became very relevant when we were doing signing up for the National Register. But anyway, as far as African Americans or Africans at the time, those who were considered just Black, colored, Negro, or whatever, that they were buried separate and apart from their owners, from anybody who was white, from anybody who feel like they were not of their element. Okay, so it's always been like that. The unfortunate thing, especially about history, about Pennsylvania history, is the fact that you're brought up in these schools here to say that, oh, Pennsylvania was a free state. And I was raised to believe that it was a free state. And not because my parents told me that, but because they told me this in school. They talked about William Penn, but what they didn't realize is that Pennsylvania was not a free state, that it was a slavery state until the late 1700s, and that the slavery here was one of those that you didn't get grandfathered in to say that you were a free person. You just got told that, well, you're going to be a slave for life. And so a lot of the people right here in our Harrisburg area, in the that soon became the 8th Ward in Harrisburg, as well as the area here in Sweater Township and Stilton, those people were still in existence, enslaved in a matter of speaking, because even with the Civil War, it did not say that you were going to be grandfathered in to be a free person. If you go and look at some of the cemeteries around here, especially out there on Paxton Street or Paxton, the Presbyterian church that's out there on Paxton, I had to because it becomes Progress Avenue, so it's Paxton. If you look in the back part of that cemetery where John Harris and some of the other people are buried, William McClay, Mr. Minnick and all that. Back in the back area, there's 2 headstones there, and they said slaves for life. But the people didn't die until the late 1800s. Slave for life. So anyway, I'm getting off on a tangent, but
I think it's important, because what people need to understand, not only in Stilton, but all over. There's little towns here. There's all over the United States. There's little towns where people were put in the ground, and there has been no honor about them. I mean, we realize that now, where we realize not only just Harrisburg, now we're coming to find out buildings have been built on top of graves. I use the word graves, not cemeteries, but graves.
Yes.
Highways have been on top, and nobody really cared. I did have an experience, and I must admit it's changed. One time I did go to Mount Vernon. Okay. And Mount Vernon, as people don't know, that is where George Washington resided.
Right.
And at one time, they had a section where they put the burial of the slaves. The first time I went, it just said, this is where the slaves were. Now, coming into modern times, it's much more sophisticated. It says this is where we honor slaves or enslaved people who were there. People don't want to understand that a lot of enslaved people, once they died, somebody just took a hole and took their bones and just threw them in there. And there was never no closure to it. So that's why I think it's important for you to come on to talk about Midland, but there's a lot of Midlands out there.
There's so many. Oh my God. Yeah, you're right there, and that's what Pennsylvania Hallowed Grounds is about, basically trying to, take care of these cemeteries. There's some down in Middletown, not the one that's on the main road as you get past the Cemetery Creek, but there's other ones that's in the backyards of people, their homes. Some of the headstones are just laying up against the fencing because somebody bought the property and they was always told it was their property. They didn't know that there were graves underneath, even despite the fact that there's headstones laying up against a fence next door. There's cemeteries that, or in a cemetery is where there is a grave, it becomes a cemetery. Okay. There's cemeteries right here within a 10-mile radius that's sitting under a mailbox, under a road. If you go into Carlisle, you'll find a cemetery that's under a park, where I literally have pictures where you have the backhoes removing the headstones and crushing them up, because they wanted the park there. And the reason why, because they said nobody was taking care of the cemetery. So what the heck? Just like at Midland, they were going to make that into a housing development. They had condemned Midland. That's why they said for me not to go on the property, And so, yeah, that means that tax base is not going to be there for them, because it is a cemetery. So
I mean, we talk about that now. I believe that there's some historical people that were in Midland. We'll just use that as the driver, because there's a lot of cemeteries and there's a lot of very important people. And I think anybody's that's a family member, somebody's important to them. So, but there are some that stand out that had history in terms of Pennsylvania. Would you share those, please?
sure. Let's start off with our veterans, since we're getting ready to come up on Memorial Weekend. And that would be those men who fought in the Civil War, known as the United States Colored Troops. And even though their term, their term while they were in the war was short, being that it was like several years, as opposed to they were not allowed in when the war actually started, even though the war was supposedly about us, as far as being Africans, and to stop enslavement. But as you know, with the Emancipation Proclamation, he does mention in there, and I mean he being Abraham Lincoln, mentions in there that if he could stop the war without freeing the slaves, he would have done so. But anyway, we had the United States Colored Troops buried at Midland Cemetery, as they are throughout many of our African cemeteries throughout the country. We have the Buffalo Soldiers, and those are the men that went out west to help take over that land from the American Indians. And they were commanded by those who had been in the Confederacy, because it was their way of giving them a job. Everybody, you had Confederates that had lost, so they needed the job also. So they had the experience of fighting. So a lot of the men, from my research and understanding, that they became the the captains, the commanders of those men that was going out west. And the Buffalo Soldier reigned all the way up until the early 1900s, as far as being very, very active. Then we also have the men that was in the Spanish-American War, the Cuban War. We have those who were, out there at Midland, even for World War I and II, as well as the Korean War, who are buried out at Midland. Now that's our veterans, and we have those who are in some of the great regiments of the Buffalo Soldiers buried out there. Mr. Osbury, who's in the 24th, and Mr. Matthew, who was in the 10th. And those are one of the, or two of the most famous regiments of the Buffalo Soldiers. They were, cavalries at that time, but they didn't have the best horses. They had the ones that had the bones sticking out of them, but they still had to deal with their horses. We also have Mr. Peter Selwyn Blackwell. He was our very first Black councilman in 1904 for the borough of Stilton. We have Mr. J.J. Jones, or Reverend J.J. Jones, and he was actually the minister who started the Mount Zion Baptist Church, which is still a viable church today. We have Mr. Fields, who actually broke ground for the monumental AME Church at 2nd and Adams Street, as it was known back in the day. He had been an ex-slave, and he broke ground for the church in the late 1800s. And then the newer church was added at the same area all the way up until like 1902, all the way through 1907, somewhere in there. We also have, let's talk about the women. We have Mary Ann Gail Tyler Dixon, who's buried there. And I've been able to trace her roots all the way from slavery, all the way to Perry County, to living here in Stilton, and that's where she died at. We also have the bodies of, or the remains of Reverend Goodwin. You heard of Goodwin Memorial Church. He's buried up there, and his son is also buried there. One of them is the older one for First Baptist Church, the other for the Goodwin Memorial Church. He actually, the church was named after him. And oh my God, we have the Daughters of Zion. We have those men that were Masonic leaders, the Odd Fellows. We have the children who were in the hygienic school for colored children, and also some of their teachers buried there. We have a barrage of people there, and also the men that were in the encampment here in right prior to World War I, that actually worked at the Bethlehem steel plant, and they brought them in from the South, and then they put them in an encampment right here in Stilton, and they housed them there, and they made sure that they were not running all over the town, and they had sheriffs there, and they when World War I was happening, they actually lined them up within the that wonderful thing that we call Bethlehem steel. They lined them up so that they could sign up for World War I. And quite a few of our men went to that war. And I have a nice listing of those veterans there buried at Midland, but some of them made it back home and had their families and community and their bank accounts and their houses and everything else. So we have a lot of wonderful people. We don't have, I guess, people that are renowned throughout the world, but what people fail to remember is that without these people at the, if you want to call them at the bottom, there would not be anybody at the top. So we have a lot of wonderful people, whether they're children or they're adults, if they were ministers or they're just community leaders or people that held up, had organizations. Everybody has a story. Everybody had a life. Everybody had a gift to add to their community.
But that's why I think it's so important to have people like you, because you're able to tell some of them stories. Like you said, everybody's not famous, but at the same time, everybody contributed something. And we have to also go back and look at why some of the people came here. I mean, I can go back and say, my mother and father are from South Carolina, and it was rough and tough. So as we know, they were part of the northern migration.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But a lot of people don't understand that. If I say the northern migration, they don't have the faintest clue what I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. Or at the same time, as I said earlier, there's a lot of cemeteries out there that we need to know about, and we need to pay honor to them, because all of them was somebody's father and somebody's mother and somebody's brother and somebody's sister, somebody's aunt, somebody's uncle, somebody's grandparent. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I think we get confused because we get so modern, and that we just say, oh, not understanding the word legacy of those people. And so I want you on here because here's a woman that took 32 years to get on the National Register. Even though I've read your quote that you said that was not what you were about being on the National Register, but you cared about that cemetery because not only of your parents, but the community and what the people there represented. Mm-hmm. And I think that by saying all that, would you not say that you were saying there's many of these cemeteries in Pennsylvania? Even though I know they're all over the United States, just like if I go to where my parents grew up at in Lakeview, South Carolina, behind the AME church, there is a cemetery there. Mm-hmm. And There's graves out there. And we all know, and I'll say it, and some of you will probably get upset with me. There were cemeteries that we didn't have no choice but to go to. And now it's a little easier to go to because it's about economics. It's about economics now. So it's not about what color you are, because before we could not go there.
Mm-hmm.
Now we can go there.
Mm-hmm.
So even though I believe in some aspects that cemeteries are hollow ground, I had an opportunity last week to go to Arlington Cemetery to witness, or whatever you want to put, one of my relatives, to see being entombed at Arlington Cemetery.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a very whew. But at the same time, when I was at Arlington Cemetery, not just for the funeral, but going on the hollow grounds, and I looked over and just saw all those tombstones and what it represented. And it represented people who felt to defend this country. And one of the things that you said, and I'd like you to elaborate on it, is that one of my things that upset me sometimes, that people don't realize that many people of color put their lives on the line for this country. And sometimes I think this country forgets it, or they assume we did not participate. Mm-hmm. Whether it's the Civil War, whether it's World War One, World War Two, and we can go on to the Korean War, we can talk about the Vietnam War. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I think it's important for you to go back to reflect to something that you said when you talked about some of those soldiers, Buffalo soldiers, and they played a very significant role in our history, but they didn't have the best of best. But they did for what they had by the best of best. And what you're saying overall, we're survivors.
Right. Well, you know, when you're talking about things like that in Arlington, I've been to Arlington several times there for my uncle, Colonel Charles Young. But when you think about it in retrospect, like with him, he died in Lagos, Nigeria. The United States government wouldn't bring him back. It took the NAACP to intercede, bring his body back to New York, and then bring him back to Washington, D.C. to have a proper burial for him at Arlington National Cemetery. When I think about Arlington National, also, I think about the area that is a very small area that used to be off in the woods or close to the woods, where they had some of the blacks buried, because at one time they were not allowed to be intermixed and buried amongst all the people, you know, the others. And it's just like Indian Town Gap. They didn't have blacks buried down there for the longest time. You know, that's just starting to happen more and more, you know, over the years. So they didn't have any Civil War veterans, you know, but let's say they didn't have any Black Civil War veterans for a long time. So, you know, it's just progression. Some of it is about tourism, you know, it's about money, you know, okay, oh, girl, well, we got these people here, so let's come and visit them. So it's a little bit of everything. You just, we just got to keep the history alive. When you're talking about these people, you know, sometimes I sit at church and I just look around the room and I'm thinking, do you know who you are? I try to tell people, think about your name. Now, how many of us have an African name? You know, that tells you already that you've been in America for at least well over 100 years, 150 years for the most of you know, maybe 400 years, because you don't have an African name. You have a white man's name attached to you. I'm a Barksdale. I'm a Thomas. I'm a Young. You know, I'm a Ridley. I'm a, you know, even with you, Utley. That's not an African name. Now we all walking around here with these here names that were apparently a good portion of us come out of slavery with that name. Like Mr. Harris up there buried at Midland Cemetery, in his obituary, it indicates that he took the last name of his favorite slave owner. That says a whole lot, just saying about your favorite slave owner, which means that he had more than one slave master. He had more than one. And then he had, obviously, they weren't all that good to him, because he took the name of his favorite, the one that treated him the best. that name. And so when I saw this man's great granddaughter at the she's was working as a receptionist at a local hospital, and I knew what her name was, but I after I made the correlation and put the two and two together, I'm like, did you know how'd you got that last name? She said, I heard something, but I didn't know anything. I said, because your great grandfather, and she's older than me, so your great grandfather took the name of his favorite slave owner. That's how you got that name, you know? And that's what we all have, a hand-me-down slave name. The majority of us. If we got I don't know, I can't say an African name, but it's either because they just adopted it or they married into it or they're just new coming into America, you know? So,
I'm glad that you talked about the importance and the significance of cemeteries, as well as what you're doing at Midland. And I want people to reach out to you, to find out if they're interested about Midland Cemetery. But there's so much, and you said that you're the cemetery lady for Pennsylvania, and you said there's a lot of other cemeteries out there that's going through the same thing. Is that correct?
oh my God, yes. Being in, not for only the Friends of Midland, but also the Hallowed Grounds. We have connections throughout the entire United States. The other day, I just did a Zoom for the National Trust and Saving Places, and we had like 500 and I think 72 people that had signed up, to listen in. And I think it ended up being like 196 or something like that that actually signed on. But it's now on the YouTube, and some people, people will look at it. But the bottom line is that this is happening all over America and beyond. When I say beyond, is because we have cemeteries that is owned by United States government in different countries, especially for those who were in wars like in Italy and such like that. In fact, we have a man that I just got his oh God, his medal, and I was able to get it placed in the African American Museum in the Carolinas. So it's going to be on display down there. I did all the research for him. I did everything for him, and they got the medal because I'm not trying to keep anything myself because I want to make sure things get into the right places. And so they were delighted to have that because it was the first one that they were going to have. Um, and so it's just very important because cemeteries, as you see behind me, there's headstones there, and those headstones represent a life. But unfortunately, there's a lot of people that are buried in the grounds, especially from the slavery time period, early 18 or even late 1800s, that didn't have the means to buy a headstone, didn't know to have a headstone. We have Washington Jordan, for instance. He's buried up there. The family made him one out of concrete, and then you can see they scratched his name into it. Well, when I was doing my research, by happenstance, found out that he was a United States color troop man. So we're going to get him a true headstone for him. And will we throw this other one away? No, we will hold on to it because we're going to show people that this is where he came from and this is what he has now. And we're going to give him the honor of having a military headstone. But there's a lot of stories out there. I was just talking to a woman the other day, and next thing you know, I start digging into her history. And I was able, within a matter of half an hour or less, I was able to find her people all the way back to slavery. I was like, oh my God. She said, can you hold off? I'm like, she said, let me just take this in, and let me get this. And I'm like, do you realize, okay, he was born in 1861, but it's also showing his parents. Do you realize because he was born in Virginia in Orange County that, oh my God, I have the names of his parents, his mom and his dad. And then there's because there was a marriage certificate that connected to that validated everything else that I was finding. And it's like, oh my God, but I can't find the name of the father of the when you start branching out, and these people have their people buried at Midland Cemetery. So, and they don't have a headstone. So I didn't know they were there. I was like, oh my God. So anyway, I just get so excited when I start finding the roots,
And I think that I think that's very important because you talked about headstones, But you also, people have to think about this. Somebody took a wood, made a cross, and put it in the ground to represent that person. And over the years, that cross, with the weather and whatever, it rotted
Uh-huh.
away, and it left no correlation that it
Right.
represented someone.
Mhm.
And that's why I wanted you to come on, because I wanted people to know the significance of the cemetery of what you're doing, but also the importance of history, because you said a lot of things there. And right now, where we're at in this country, a lot of people don't want to talk about what you just talked about. They want to talk about, and I hear it sometimes, why are we talking about yesteryear? Why aren't we talking about today? But
Mhm.
I'm a believer that you got to have foundation. And one of the things that I think that's very important, especially for people of color, young people need to know that there were some very significant people that were their uncles and brothers and sisters that nobody never talked about. Because
Mhm.
too often, that's why I have this program, because too often we hear so much about negativity, and I decided that we need to tell our own story and
Mhm.
we need to define who we are. And so that's why I wanted to have someone like you on, because you can do that. I mean, the time has went so fast, but I'd like for you the next few minutes to be able to share with the audience what you want them to get from our conversation.
Wow. Well, I think that hopefully that they've learned something about Pennsylvania history, about American history, even in this little snippets of information that I was able to share. But even more importantly, to understand what their beginnings are, to take a look in the mirror and say, is my eyebrows because of my grandmother? Are the attributes of the gift of gab, because of my grandfather? Was he, do I like politics because of the ancestors that I have never met, but they're wrapped up inside of me? Which piece of this cell goes all the way back to the beginning of mankind? Because somewhere along the line, I have that attribute, whether they were enslaved or not, you have a bit of an attribute that is in that DNA and it's coming out in you. I want these young people, especially our children of the Black and Brown children, to understand that they are more than just what people are telling them. As someone said the other day, you can come into this world poor, but it also depends on how you want to leave. You don't have to leave poor, but you can leave with something, a mark behind that is good and positive. I want people to understand that that's what the cemeteries are about. It is about the ancestors. That's the reason why you're here. So be grateful that they survived the Great Voyage, that they made it to Johnstown, that they made it to Pennsylvania, that they made it to Swider Township, and that they thrive. And that's why you are still here, because they endured so much so you could get your education, that you could benefit from that and share it with the world. Be that neighborly person that you can share with the kids next door, or be that mentor to somebody to tell them that they are more than what they think they are. Maybe they're coming from a distressed house. Let them know that they can do better. They don't have to do what's going on in the house. They can do better than what's in the house. And if the house is really good inside, make it even better. It's just like piece of artwork. Work with it and mold it, shape it, and make it even better. So my thing is for people to embrace their history, love their history, share their history, and honor those who have went before us, but also try to pull what they wanted to leave behind, whether they told you verbally or they're telling you because of what you have researched, or just because you're sitting down meditating and you hear that God is telling you it's okay, that there's a better day coming, and that you have a good moment to share with the people, and just embrace the Utleys of the world, the Harrises of the world, the Matthews of the world, Peter Sullivan Blackwells of the world, and just tell their stories. Don't let their stories die. Don't let the cemeteries go into a disarray again. Restore, preserve, educate, and share. Keep it live. Keep it real.
Good. I want to thank you for your words of wisdom. As you said, it's just so important that we have to tell our story. And getting some bumps in the road now, but I think that people like you will help us to continue to tell our story. But you will be that beacon of light out there that hopefully someone will see you and want to do some of the things that you're doing, or understanding what you're trying to tell us, because all of us have some good.
Mhm.
And I'm tired of sometimes we see it on TV and all those other places, the negativity. But now with people like you telling us what some of our forefathers have gone through, even though they can't tell it to us, but they can leave that message through the hollow grounds of the cemetery.
Yes, for sure.
I want to thank you very much. And those of you, please be proud of this lady. 32 years she's been working in Midtown, and now it's a national register. And there's a lot of cemeteries out there. There's one in Middletown and all over in different little places, even in little towns that have just a handful of Black folks. Guess what? They were somebody. And don't forget that. We all are somebody. So thank you for being a part of my program tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining the Richard Utley Show on The Voice 17104. We will be here on The Voice 17104 every first and third Tuesday from 6:30 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. Once again, thanks for viewing. Remember to visit us on Facebook at Richard Utley, and we welcome your questions and or comments.